A blade flashed in the most exclusive bar in Miami. Guests screamed, tables crashed to the floor, and the old security guard was shoved down hard onto the ground. Everyone ran, except one person. The night shift bartender walked straight toward the man holding the knife. No trembling, no screaming. She looked him in the eyes and spoke in a calm, even tone, as if she were simply asking what he wanted to drink. In the dark corner at the back of the bar, a man sat in silence, watching the whole scene from start to finish. He didn't call the police. He didn't step in. He just watched. Because that man was the true owner of the building, and the most powerful underground boss on the entire East Coast. That night, he had just found the one thing his empire couldn't buy. What happened after that night? Stay with this story until the very end, because the way it finishes will stay with you for a long time. If this story touched you, hit the like button so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that life can still change. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. But to understand the story of that night, we need to go back a few days. Back to the life of a girl named Jolene Carter. 2 o'clock in the morning, the last shift of the week ended. Jolene took off her apron, folded it neatly into her employee locker, then stepped out into the parking lot behind the Amber Room. Her legs ached after 8 straight hours on her feet, but she didn't have time to think about that. She drove her old car through the late-night streets of Miami, past buildings still glowing with light, past bars where the music was still pounding. The world beyond the windshield kept sliding backward, while Jolene kept moving forward, toward the small apartment on the western edge of the city. She stopped the car in front of the door, turned off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds, breathing. Then she opened the door and went inside. In the living room, the woman who watched her mother was sitting on the sofa, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "She's been asleep since 10. Nothing unusual today." Jolene nodded, paid the woman, then closed the door behind her. The apartment fell silent. She stepped quietly into her mother's room first. Darlene Carter, 55 years old, lay on her side in bed, breathing evenly. Her face looked peaceful in sleep, nothing like it did during the day, when she stared at everything around her with the confused eyes of someone who no longer recognized the very home she lived in. Alzheimer's had come for Darlene earlier than anyone in the family had ever imagined. She was only 52 when the doctor gave them the diagnosis. 3 years had passed, and the illness had only grown worse. Jolene pulled the blanket back over her mother, then went into the room beside it. Bree, 7 years old, was curled up with her teddy bear in her arms, her mouth slightly open, sleeping deeply. On the little study desk beside the bed, several drawings made with crayons lay scattered everywhere. Bree liked to draw. That was how the little girl understood the world. Jolene looked at her niece for a while, then softly closed the bedroom door. Bree was the daughter of Trent, Jolene's older brother, who had died 3 years earlier. After Trent was gone, his wife couldn't bear it and left, never coming back. Bree stayed with Jolene. The little girl was only 4 then. Jolene returned to the kitchen table and opened the old tin box where she kept every bill. Her mother's medicine for the month, $1,200. Rent, $950. Daytime caregiver, $800. Food, electricity, water, gas, school supplies for Bree. She added it up. Then she added it again. She was short $800. Jolene closed her eyes. Both hands rested on the table, her fingers tightening lightly around the edge of the paper. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a very long time. Crying didn't pay bills. She opened her eyes, turned the sheet over, and calculated again, searching for something, anything, she could cut. There was nothing. Every month was the same. She had already cut down to the bone. Once, Jolene had sat in a college lecture hall, listening to a professor speak about clinical psychology. She was a good student. She liked listening to people, understanding why they behaved the way they did, why they were afraid, why they were angry. She was only 1 semester short of graduating, but then her mother got sick, then Trent died, then Bree needed someone. And Jolene left school, took the night shift at the bar because the tips were better at night, and during the day, she could stay home with her mother before the caregiver arrived. Her life was a loop. Work, come home, care for her mother, care for her niece, count the money, come up short, go back to work again. There was no room for dreams, no room for herself. Jolene didn't complain. She simply lived, one day at a time, like someone walking a wire who wasn't allowed to look down. The next morning, Jolene was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when she heard small feet pattering across the floor. Bree ran out of the bedroom, her hair tangled, her eyes still sleepy, but her mouth already smiling. The little girl rushed straight into Jolene's lap and wrapped her arms tightly around her aunt's neck. "Auntie, did you smile today?" Jolene looked down at that tiny face, at those round eyes waiting for the answer as though it were the most important thing in the world. She smiled. The first smile after a long night. "Yes, because you woke up early and hugged me." Bree grinned wide, then ran off to get her box of crayons and started drawing on a blank sheet of paper right there on the kitchen floor. Jolene looked at her niece, then looked down at the cup of coffee in her hand. $800 was still missing. Her mother was still sick. Her life still had no way out. But every morning, Bree still asked her whether she had smiled. And every morning, because of Bree, Jolene still found a reason to smile. A few days later, Jolene went to work the night shift as usual. She didn't know that on that night, at the Amber Room, everything would change. At the same time, on the other side of Miami, inside an upscale seafood restaurant, on the 23rd floor of a tower overlooking Biscayne Bay, there was a room no customer knew existed. The room was behind the kitchen, completely soundproof, with no windows. To get in, a person had to pass through a narrow hallway, turn left at the wine rack, then knock exactly 3 times on the oak door. That was where Grant Holloway handled business. Not the kind of business written on paper, the kind of business that never appeared in any financial report. That night, a middle-aged man was kneeling in front of Grant, both his knees pressed against the marble floor. Sweat ran from his forehead down to his chin, dripping onto the white shirt that had already been wrinkled and ruined. He owed Grant's organization a large sum, had been overdue for 2 months, and tonight was the 3rd time he had been invited in for a conversation. 3 of Grant's men stood around them, silent, their faces blank. No one said anything. No one needed to. The silence in that room was heavier than any threat. Grant sat in the leather chair at the head of the table, his hands clasped together, looking at the debtor with eyes that held no anger, no pity, and no contempt, only observation, like a man weighing whether the chess piece in front of him still had any use left. The man stammered, begging for more time, his voice shaking so badly that every sentence swallowed half its own words. Grant didn't interrupt. He let him finish. Then he spoke, very softly. So softly that the 3 men had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "I'll give you 30 more days. Not because I'm kind, because I know you have a family." The debtor lifted his head, his eyes red, tears spilling out. He bowed his head and thanked Grant over and over, his voice choking until the words were barely sounds. Grant stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room without looking back. He moved down the hallway and stepped into the private elevator. One of his men followed behind him and asked quietly as the elevator doors closed, "Boss, what if he still doesn't pay in 30 days?" Grant paused for a few seconds. He didn't turn around. "Then I won't be kind anymore." The man fell silent. He didn't ask another question. Grant Holloway, 33 years old, was, on paper, the chairman of Holloway Holdings, a high-end real estate and entertainment investment group headquartered in Miami. He owned hotels, nightclubs, restaurant chains, and 2 resort projects still under construction. The press occasionally mentioned him as a successful young businessman, private, discreet, and rarely seen in public. But that was only the outer shell. Beneath it, Grant controlled one of the most powerful underground networks on the east coast of the United States. Loan sharking, illegal betting, money laundering through legitimate businesses. Everything ran like a machine, quiet, precise, and ruthless when it had to be. Grant wasn't the kind of crime boss from the movies, raising his voice, waving a gun, or showing off his power. He was the opposite. He spoke little, very little, and when he lowered his voice below its usual level, when every word slowed as though he were weighing each syllable, that was when everyone around him held their breath. Because Grant Holloway was not at his most dangerous when he was angry. He was most dangerous when he was calm. When he was 16 years old, his father died, betrayed by the very person closest to him. From that moment on, Grant built his empire on one principle: trust no one. He bought loyalty with money. He kept people with fear, and he was always alone. Even when people surrounded him, no one sat down to dinner with him because they wanted to hear him talk. No one called him on his birthday. No one asked whether he was all right today. Grant didn't complain about that. He didn't think it was a problem. Loneliness, to him, was a reasonable price to pay for safety. The elevator opened in the basement. The black car was already waiting. The driver opened the door, and Grant stepped inside. As the car pulled away, the driver looked through the rearview mirror. "Home, boss?" Grant looked out through the window. Miami's late-night streets were still alive, neon lights reflecting on the wet pavement after the evening rain. The Amber Room. The driver nodded and turned right at the next intersection. The Amber Room, the most elegant cocktail lounge in Miami. On paper, it belonged to a subsidiary within the Holloway holding system. In truth, it was Grant's bar. He went there once a month, sat in the dark corner at the back, drank exactly one glass, and watched. No one in the place knew he was the owner. He preferred it that way. That night, Grant arrived at the Amber Room the way he always did. He didn't know that night would be different from every other night, that he would witness a night shift bartender do the one thing an entire room full of people didn't dare to do, and that the moment would change his life in a way money and power never had. 15 minutes after everything ended, the police arrived. 2 patrol cars parked in front of the Amber Room, their red and blue lights sweeping across the glass facade of the lounge. Most of the guests had already been evacuated, with only a few people staying behind to give statements. Jolene stood beside the bar, calmly answering each question from the officer taking notes. She remembered everything clearly. Every detail, every movement, the exact sequence of events from the moment that group walked in until the moment they were restrained. The officer looked up at her after finishing the second page. He had been doing this for more than 15 years, taking statements from hundreds of witnesses, and he knew that after an incident like this, most people would ramble, mix things up, or forget everything. But the girl standing in front of him recounted it all as if she were reading from a report. Nothing extra, nothing missing, nothing out of place. He closed his notebook and nodded. "You're the best witness I've met this year." Jolene didn't answer. She only gave a small shrug, then turned toward Big Ray. The old security guard was sitting on a chair near the door, while a paramedic bandaged the scrape on his forehead. Big Ray was 60 years old, a veteran, and he had worked security at the Amber Room since the day the place opened. He was the only person in the lounge who called Jolene daughter. When Jolene came close, Big Ray reached out his large, broad hand and took hers. "You're crazy, daughter, but thank you." Jolene smiled faintly and patted the back of his hand. "Rest, Ray. I'll clean up." Then she returned to the bar as if nothing had happened. She picked up each shard of broken glass from the floor and gathered it into the trash. She wiped up the spilled liquor, set the tables and chairs back in place, and checked on every remaining guest to see whether anyone needed water or a ride called. Her hands kept moving, quick, clean, precise, in the same order as every night when she closed the lounge. But anyone who looked closely would have seen those hands trembling slightly. Very slightly. The trembling didn't come from fear. It came from a body finally releasing what the mind had held back for the past 15 minutes. Jolene knew her hands were shaking. She didn't try to hide it. She only kept working, because stopping now meant facing that feeling. And she didn't have time for feelings. In the dark corner at the back of the lounge, Grant Holloway was still sitting there. The drink in front of him was almost untouched. 2 of his men at the other table glanced toward him, waiting for an order. One of them placed a hand on his phone, ready to call in more men if needed. Grant gave a slight shake of his head. No need. He wasn't looking at his men. He was looking at Jolene. He watched her pick up broken glass, watched her wipe the floor, watched her ask an elderly guest whether he needed a glass of water, watched her trembling hands while her face did not change. Grant had lived 33 years in a world where everyone could be bought, threatened, or broken. He had met hundreds of people who claimed they were brave, only to collapse when they faced real danger. He had hired the best people money could buy, and he knew their loyalty ended at the last number written on the check. But that girl over there, the night shift bartender with trembling hands after stepping in front of a man holding a knife, didn't collapse. She shook, but she still cleaned the tables. She was afraid, but she still checked on the guests. She did all of that not because anyone was paying her to do it, but because she chose to. Grant sat there for a few more minutes. Then he stood. He took a white envelope from the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed it on the table. Beside the envelope, he placed a small business card. The card was pure white, with no logo, no name, no title, only a phone number. Then he walked out the back door, got into his car, and disappeared into the Miami night. Not a word. 20 minutes later, when the lounge was nearly empty, Jolene cleaned her way to the table in the dark corner. She lifted the almost full glass of liquor, about to pour it out. When she saw the envelope, she set the glass down and picked up the envelope. Heavy. She opened it. Inside was a stack of cash. She counted it. $5,000. Jolene stood still. Then she saw the business card. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand. No name, no logo, only 10 digits. She stood in the middle of the empty bar, holding the card, her eyes fixed on the number. She didn't know who that man was, didn't know what he wanted, didn't know why he had left this money behind. But Jolene knew one thing. $5,000 could buy her mother 3 months of medicine, and in her life, 3 months was a whole stretch of breathing room. Jolene used that money the very next day. $1,200 went to her mother's medicine. $800 went to the caregiver she had owed since the month before. She set the rest aside, and for the first time in many months, she had a small emergency cushion, without having to calculate again and again to see whether it would be enough. But money was something she could spend. The business card was not. It lay on the kitchen table, right beside the tin box where she kept the bills, pure white against the pile of yellowing papers. Every time Jolene walked past it, her eyes stopped there for a few seconds. 10 digits, no name. Nothing came up online when she tried to search for it. That phone number seemed not to exist in any system an ordinary person could access. Who was the man who had left that money behind? What did he want from her? Was it safe? The questions circled through Jolene's mind for 5 days. She didn't tell anyone. Not Big Ray, not her mother's caregiver, not any coworker at the lounge. She kept the card as if she were keeping a secret even she didn't yet know what to do with, until one afternoon, Bree ran into the kitchen to get a drink of water, and her eyes caught the business card on the table. Bree picked it up, turning it over and over, her eyes wide and round. "Auntie, who gave you this? It's so pretty, so white." Jolene looked at her niece and couldn't answer. She only smiled, gently took the card from Bree's hand, and told the little girl to go draw. Bree ran off and forgot it at once, but Jolene didn't forget. Bree's innocent question pulled her back to reality. It had been 5 days. If she didn't call, this card would remain nothing more than a blank piece of paper forever. If she did call, she didn't know what would happen. But Jolene had lived 27 years by facing the things she didn't know. She picked up her phone, dialed the number. The first ring, the second ring, then someone answered. Holloway. One word, a low voice, brief, with no greeting. Jolene swallowed lightly, then spoke. "I'm Jolene Carter. I work as a bartender at the Amber Room. You left an envelope on my table 5 days ago." Silence held for a few seconds on the other end of the line, then that low voice continued, slowly. 5 days. Longer than I thought. Jolene didn't know how to understand that sentence. Was he praising her or criticizing her? Was he testing her or disappointed in her? She didn't ask. She waited. Grant continued. He wanted to meet her. He gave her an address, a penthouse on the highest floor of a tower in downtown Miami. Jolene listened, stayed silent for a beat, then said, "No, I'm not going to the private home of a man whose full name I don't even know." The other end of the line went silent, longer than before. Then Grant said, his voice not angry, not surprised, only a little slower, as if he were processing a situation he wasn't used to encountering. "Then you choose." 3 words. Jolene chose a coffee shop in Brickell, in broad daylight, crowded, with large glass windows facing the street. Grant agreed. The next morning, at 10 o'clock, Jolene arrived at the cafe. Grant was already seated. He wore a dark suit and sat alone, with an untouched cup of black coffee in front of him. He had brought no one. Jolene sat down across from him. The two of them looked at each other. Grant didn't circle around the point. He said he was looking for someone for a special position inside his business organization, not a secretary, not an assistant. Someone who could handle sensitive situations, difficult negotiations, difficult partners, matters that required absolute calm, the kind no one else in his company possessed. He didn't need a degree. He needed someone with the nerve to control a room without raising her voice. The salary would be 10 times what she currently earned. Full health insurance for her entire family. Jolene listened and didn't react right away. She looked at Grant, then asked one question. "You know about my mother?" Grant didn't answer. He only looked at her, and that silence was the clearest answer of all. He had investigated her. He knew about Darlene, knew about Bree, knew she had left school, knew she was short $800 every month. He knew all of it before sitting down at this table. Jolene wasn't angry. She understood. In this man's world, knowing everything about the other person before meeting them was how he survived. She took a breath, then said in a steady, clear voice, "I'll accept, but I have one condition. I won't do anything illegal, no matter what it is." Grant looked at her, for a long time, not the assessing look he had given her the first time at the bar. This time, he looked at her as if he were weighing something larger than this conversation itself. Then he said, "I'm not hiring you to break the law. I'm hiring you because you're the only person I've ever met who can control a room without having to break the law." He placed another business card on the table, this time printed with the company name and address. Holloway Holdings, 40th floor, downtown Miami. Come here Monday morning. The contract will be ready. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked away. No handshake. Nothing more. Jolene remained seated, watching him leave through the door. And she realized one thing. During the entire conversation, Grant Holloway hadn't smiled once. Not because he was cold. His eyes, when he looked at her, weren't cold, only tired. Tired in the way of a man who had gone too long without anyone to trust. Jolene picked up the new business card and turned it over. Holloway Holdings, 40th floor, Monday. Her life was about to turn onto a completely different road, and she didn't know where that road would lead her. Monday morning, Jolene stood in front of the 42-story glass building of Holloway Holdings in downtown Miami. She lifted her head and looked up. The glass facade reflecting the blue sky, and the white clouds drifting slowly overhead. 2 weeks ago, she had been mopping the floor of a bar at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now she was standing here, about to step into an elevator and go up to the 40th floor of a corporation she had never even heard of, before reading its name on a business card. She breathed in, then she walked inside. The 40th floor was strangely quiet, not noisy the way Jolene had imagined. The stone floor gleamed, the hallway was wide, and natural light poured in through the large glass windows running along both sides. A receptionist led her to a private office. Her office was right beside Grant Holloway's. When the office door closed, Jolene stood in the middle of the room, with its oak desk, leather chair, and a window overlooking all of Biscayne Bay. She understood the message immediately. The location of the office was a statement. Anyone who stepped onto the 40th floor would see that her office sat right next to the boss's office. No one needed to say a word. Everyone would understand on their own that she wasn't an ordinary employee. Jolene hadn't even had time to sit down before the office door opened. A tall man with neatly combed hair and an expensive gray suit walked in. He didn't knock. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, his smile wide but never reaching his eyes. Warren Prescott, Chief Operating Officer. He held out his hand, his voice cheerful in a carefully calculated way. "I heard you used to mix cocktails. Interesting. Around here, we usually hire people with degrees, but Grant has always enjoyed surprises." Jolene looked at the hand he offered, then looked up into Warren's eyes. She didn't stand. She sat right there in the chair, calm and composed. "I like surprises too. Just a different kind." The smile on Warren's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, enough for Jolene to notice. He hadn't come to say hello. He had come to measure her, to see who she was, how hard she was, whether she could be crushed easily. Warren gave a faint laugh, tapped the doorframe lightly, then walked away. During the first week, Jolene did nothing but observe. She read files. She sat quietly in meetings, not speaking, only listening. She paid attention to who said what in the conference room and who said what in the hallway, who avoided looking at whom when money was mentioned, who changed their tone when Grant walked in, who looked at Warren before answering a question. She mapped the company's power structure by the instinct of someone who had studied psychology for 4 years. No one had taught her how to read people in a corporate environment, but 4 years in lecture halls, combined with 3 years mixing cocktails for every kind of person, had given her something a degree couldn't buy, the ability to see what people were trying to hide. And the thing she saw most clearly was that Warren Prescott was isolating her. During the first week, Jolene wasn't invited to 3 meetings she should have attended. Twice, when she requested project files, she was told the file was being updated and wasn't ready yet. A lower-level employee avoided her when she asked about the organizational structure, then awkwardly said she should ask human resources instead of asking directly. Jolene understood. Warren was sending a signal to the entire 40th floor. Don't cooperate with her. She doesn't belong here. She's just a cocktail girl, the boss pulled in for some reason. Jolene didn't react. She didn't go to Grant to complain. She didn't confront Warren. She took notes. Every meeting she was left out of, she recorded the date and time. Every unanswered email, she saved a copy. Every time someone refused to provide documents, she wrote down the name of the person who refused. She didn't know when she would need these things, but she knew that if she ever did, she would have them ready. Grant observed it all from a distance. He knew what Warren was doing. He knew Jolene was being isolated. He didn't interfere. Not because he didn't care, because he wanted to see. How long could this girl endure it? And more importantly, how would she endure it? Would she collapse, complain, or push back? The answer came at the end of the second week. Grant called Jolene into his office and placed a thin file on the desk. A food supplier for Holloway Holdings restaurant chain was threatening to cancel its contract. Warren had handled it earlier by squeezing the price, demanding that the supplier reduce costs or lose the contract. The supplier couldn't take it anymore and had cut off deliveries. 3 restaurants in the chain were short on ingredients. Grant looked at Jolene. Resolve it in 24 hours. No further explanation. No instruction. Just one order and one file. Jolene took the file back to her office and read it for 30 minutes. Then she got in her car and drove straight to the outskirts of Miami, to the farm of Boyd Redmond, the supplier's owner. Boyd was a man in his 50s, sun-browned, with rough hands that belonged to someone who had worked the land his whole life. He greeted Jolene with caution on his face. Another person from Holloway had come to pressure him, but Jolene didn't pressure him. She asked why he had cut off deliveries. Boyd told her. It wasn't because he wanted to cancel the contract. It was because a larger competitor was forcing him to lower his prices for them, threatening that if he kept supplying Holloway, they would cancel all of his other contracts. Boyd was trapped between both sides. If he supplied Holloway, he would lose the other side. If he stopped supplying Holloway, he would lose his biggest source of revenue. He wasn't greedy. He was trying to survive. Jolene listened, then nodded. She made a direct proposal. Holloway Holdings would sign a 3-year long-term contract with Boyd, guaranteeing stable volume and fixed pricing. With a 3-year contract from Holloway, Boyd wouldn't need the competitor anymore. He would have enough security to refuse them without fearing he would lose everything. Boyd looked at Jolene for a long moment. Then he asked, "Do you have the authority to sign a 3-year contract?" Jolene answered directly, "I'll bring this proposal back. If you agree in principle, I'll have the signature within 24 hours. Boyd nodded. They shook hands. Jolene drove back to the office, wrote the proposal, and sent it to Grant. Grant read it in 5 minutes, signed it, didn't ask a single additional question. From the moment she received the assignment to the moment it was resolved, less than 6 hours had passed. When Jolene presented the result, Grant nodded. He didn't praise her, didn't say good job or you're good. He only nodded, then placed another file on the desk, 3 times thicker than the first. Mrs. Pearl Whitfield, 80 years old. She owns the last house on the land we need to build the resort. She refuses to sell. Warren has tried. The lawyers have tried. She called us sharks in the newspaper. Grant looked at Jolene. You have 48 hours. Jolene didn't go to see Mrs. Pearl right away. She spent that evening researching, reading everything she could find about the woman and the land, and she found what she needed. The next morning, Jolene drove to an old neighborhood on the southern outskirts of Miami, where an entire row of houses had been demolished to make room for Holloway Holdings' resort project. Only one house remained. A small house, its white paint yellowed with age, its roof tiles old, a low wooden fence surrounding it, and in front of the house, there was a rose garden. Jolene stopped the car, stepped out, and looked at the garden. Roses of every color had been planted in neat rows, each bush spaced evenly from the next. Even though all around it was empty land, and excavators were parked less than 100 meters away, the garden was still carefully tended, as if it existed in a world of its own, untouched by everything happening beyond the fence. Jolene walked to the door and knocked. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then the door opened. Mrs. Pearl Whitfield stood there, 80 years old, her back slightly bent, but her eyes sharp as a blade. She looked Jolene up and down, then looked at the car parked on the street. "If you're from Holloway, the door's already closed." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Jolene didn't say where she was from. She looked past the woman's shoulder, toward the garden out front, then asked, "Ma'am, the rose garden in front of your house is beautiful. Who planted it?" Mrs. Pearl stopped. Her hand, which had been gripping the edge of the door, ready to close it, suddenly loosened. She looked at Jolene, then looked out at the garden. Her eyes changed. They were no longer sharp. They softened, as if that question had touched a place inside her that had no fence to protect it. She opened the door wider. "Come in." The two women sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Pearl made tea, set 2 cups on the table, then began to tell the story. Her husband, Robert Whitfield, had planted that garden over 40 years. He started the day they were newly married. The first red rosebush he planted during the first week they moved into this house, telling her that every time she saw it bloom, she would remember that day. Then came the white rosebush, planted the year their son was born. Robert carried the baby out into the garden, laid him on a blanket beside the newly planted rosebush, and said the two of them would grow up together. Then the yellow rosebush, planted on the day Robert retired. He said that from then on, he would have the whole day to care for the garden, and he wouldn't have to hurry anymore. "Mrs. Pearl spoke slowly, each sentence steady, as if she had told this story in her mind thousands of times, but it had been a very long time since anyone had sat down to listen. Robert had died 6 years ago. The garden was the only thing left of him. Every rosebush was a memory. Every petal was a day they had lived together. She wasn't refusing to sell the house because she hated Holloway. She was refusing because selling the house meant losing the garden, and losing the garden meant losing Robert a second time. Jolene listened from beginning to end. She didn't interrupt, didn't look at the clock, didn't steer the conversation elsewhere. She only listened. When Mrs. Pearl finally stopped, the tea in her hand had long gone cold, and only then did Jolene speak. "Ma'am, what if there were a way to keep the garden?" Mrs. Pearl looked at her, not yet believing. Jolene continued, "The new resort would have a community garden, open to everyone in the area. That garden would be named after Robert Whitfield. Mrs. Pearl's entire rose garden would be moved by a professional team, bush by bush, with the relative arrangement preserved exactly as it was now, then replanted in the new garden. The red bush, the white bush, the yellow bush, all of them. And Mrs. Pearl would receive a free apartment in the resort for the rest of her life, with a window looking straight out at the garden bearing her husband's name. Every morning when she woke up, she would still see Robert's roses. But now, she wouldn't be the only one who saw them. The whole community would. The garden wouldn't die with the house. It would live longer than her, longer than Jolene, longer than everyone in that room." Mrs. Pearl was silent for a very long time. Her eyes were wet. She didn't sob aloud, but tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, following the folds of a face that had carried 80 years. "You're not like the others," she said softly. Jolene looked at her, and in that moment, she wasn't thinking about 48 hours, wasn't thinking about Holloway Holdings, wasn't thinking about Grant or Warren. She was thinking about her mother, about Darlene, about the evenings she sat beside her, holding a hand her mother no longer recognized as belonging to anyone she knew. "Because I have someone I'm afraid of losing too, ma'am." Mrs. Pearl looked at Jolene, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, then nodded. The next day, she signed the agreement. When Jolene returned to the office and presented the result during the internal meeting, Warren Prescott sat across from her, his face dark red. He didn't say a word. His legal team had failed for 3 months. Jolene had solved it in 2 days. Grant sat at the head of the table, listened to Jolene's report, and said only 2 words. "Keep going." Then he stood and left the conference room. But before he walked out the door, his eyes stopped on Jolene. Longer than usual. It wasn't the assessing look from the first time at the bar. It wasn't the tired look from the meeting at the coffee shop either. This time, there was something in his eyes that Jolene had never seen in him before. Maybe curiosity, maybe respect, or maybe both. The next test came immediately after that. Hank Morrison, the owner of the largest port in the South Florida region, was the man who controlled the shipping route that mattered to the entire business operation of Holloway Holdings. Grant needed a partnership agreement with Morrison to expand the logistics route for his resort and restaurant chain. Grant's 2 best lawyers had already gone to meet Hank. Both had returned empty-handed. Hank Morrison was the kind of man who didn't trust paperwork, and he didn't trust people in suits either. Jolene drove to the beer tavern by the port in the afternoon, wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and low shoes. No suit, no briefcase. She walked into the tavern, looked around, and saw Hank sitting alone at a corner table, with a glass of beer already half empty in front of him. He was over 60, broad-shouldered, with large hands and a face darkened by the sun and wind of the docks. When Jolene sat down across from him, Hank looked her over from head to toe, then burst out laughing. Is Holloway out of people now? Sending a girl? Jolene didn't laugh with him. She looked straight into his eyes, her voice calm. You're mistaken. He sent the only person willing to listen to you talk. Hank stopped laughing. He looked at her for a few more seconds, then leaned back and crossed his arms. Fine. Talk. But Jolene didn't talk about the deal. She asked him about the port. How long had this port been operating? Was his father the one who built it? How long had the Morrison family been tied to this place? At first, Hank was guarded, answering in short, clipped sentences. But when Jolene asked about his father, his voice slowed. He began to tell her. His father had opened the port in the 1960s, when there had been nothing in this area except swamp and mosquitoes. He built every dock, every warehouse, by hand and sweat. Hank had grown up on that port, knowing the smell of engine oil before he knew how to read. He took over from his father and kept it running for 30 years. To him, the port wasn't property, it was his family. Jolene listened to it all, then spoke directly. Your son wants to modernize the port. You're fighting him. But you know what? He doesn't want to take the port away from you. He wants to prove to you that he's worthy of inheriting it. Hank went silent. His eyes lowered to the glass of beer, his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden tabletop. Jolene continued. Holloway Holdings would invest in modernizing half of the port. Hank's son would operate the new section. Hank would keep control of the old section and run it the way he always had. The Morrison family would lose nothing. They would only gain more, and father and son would stand together on the same port instead of standing on opposite shores. Hank didn't answer right away. He sat still for a long time, looking out the tavern window, where the port cranes cut dark silhouettes against the evening sky. Then he nodded. Slowly, one single nod. The agreement was reached. Jolene drove back, both hands gripping the steering wheel. She had just solved the third challenge in a row. Boyd Redmond, Mrs. Pearl Whitfield, Hank Morrison, 3 completely different people, 3 completely different problems, but with one thing in common. None of them needed to be forced. They needed to be heard. But while Jolene was conquering each challenge outside, inside Grant Holloway's empire, a crack was spreading. And that crack bore the name of someone Grant had trusted for 10 years. That crack had a name. Vince Caruso. Vince had been with Grant from the very first day, from the time Grant was only 23 years old and had nothing but anger and an empire still in its infancy. 10 years. Vince was the man who stood behind Grant in every dangerous negotiation. The man who drove Grant through nights when no one else was allowed to know where Grant was going. The only person permitted to call Grant by his real name instead of boss. 10 years of loyalty. Or at least, that was what Grant had believed. 2 weeks earlier, an inside source told Grant that someone within the organization had been secretly communicating with Donovan Kessler. Donovan Kessler, the boss who controlled northern Florida, Grant's direct rival, and the man connected to the death of Grant's father more than 17 years earlier. When Grant received the call recording and heard Vince's voice on the other end, he didn't get angry. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He didn't call anyone in. He only sat alone in his office, listened to the recording 3 times, then turned off the phone. And he waited. 2 weeks, 14 days of watching Vince move through the building, attend meetings, give reports, laugh and talk with coworkers, walk into Grant's office every morning and ask, "Anything you need me to handle today, boss?" 14 days in which Grant knew the truth, while Vince didn't know Grant knew. And during those 14 days, Grant observed. He watched who Vince called, who he met, who he texted, so that when the moment came, the whole picture would be complete. Then the moment came. Grant invited Vince to dinner. The familiar restaurant, the familiar table, the familiar dishes. The 2 men sat across from each other and talked as if everything were normal. Grant asked about Vince's family, about the new car Vince had just bought, about the soccer game over the weekend. Vince was relaxed, laughing often, ordering more wine. He suspected nothing. For 10 years, every time Grant invited him to a private dinner, it had always been something ordinary between two brothers. The meal lasted nearly 2 hours. When the final plate had been cleared away, when the glass of wine was nearly empty, Grant placed his phone in the middle of the table. The screen lit up. On it was an audio file, already playing. Vince's voice came through the small speaker, clear and unmistakable, speaking to someone both of them knew. The content of the call was Holloway Holdings' internal information, Grant's travel schedule, details of deals still under negotiation, the names of important partners. Vince listened to his own voice coming from the phone, and his face went pale. The hand he had placed on the table began to tremble. His eyes moved to Grant, then dropped down, then lifted back to Grant again. Grant didn't speak right away. He let the recording play for another 30 seconds before he turned it off. The room fell silent. Then Grant spoke, his voice soft and slow. 10 years, Vince. I trusted you for 10 years. Vince opened his mouth, trying to explain. Boss, listen to me. I didn't have a choice. Donovan forced me. Grant raised one hand. He said nothing, only raised his hand. Vince fell silent halfway through, as if someone had squeezed the words shut inside his throat. In Grant's organization, when he raised his hand, it meant there was nothing left to say. But before Grant stood up, Vince said one more thing. His voice shook, but the sentence was clear. I wasn't the one who contacted Donovan on my own. Warren Prescott is the mastermind. Warren started contacting Donovan's people 6 months ago. I was only the middleman. Warren has been selling inside information to Donovan in exchange for money and promises. Grant looked at Vince, not surprised. No reaction. He only gave a faint nod, as if he had just received the final piece of a picture whose outline he had seen long ago. Then he stood and walked out of the room. Not another word. 2 other men entered, closing the door behind them. Vince looked at them, then at the closed door, then down at the table. He understood. He would never sit at this table again. Never step into the Holloway Holdings building again. Never call Grant boss again. 10 years ended over one dinner. Outside the restaurant, Grant got into the back seat of the car. The driver didn't ask where to go. The car stayed still. Grant sat motionless in the darkness, alone. He looked down at his left wrist. The old watch rested there, its glass face slightly scratched, its leather strap worn. His father's watch. The only thing left from the man who had died because he was betrayed by the person closest to him. And now, history had repeated itself. Vince, the man Grant trusted most, had betrayed him. Exactly like his father, betrayed by the person nearest to him. Grant sat there, looking at the watch, not knowing how long time passed. Then a thought crossed his mind. In this entire empire, among dozens of people he paid, dozens of people who swore loyalty to him, the only one who had no reason to betray him was the night shift bartender, who had been there for less than a month. She didn't need his power. She didn't want anyone's position. She only needed a job to save her family, and that very harmlessness, paradoxically, made her the only person he could trust. Jolene was good at hiding things. She hid her exhaustion behind the polite smile she wore every morning when she stepped into the office. Hid her loneliness behind the lunches she ate alone in her office because no one invited her to sit with them. Hid the feeling of not belonging every time she walked down the hallway on the 40th floor and saw eyes flick toward her, then quickly turn away. On the outside, she was winning. Boyd Redmond, Mrs. Pearl, Hank Morrison. 3 tests, 3 successes. But inside, Jolene was running dry. She lived between 2 worlds and belonged to neither one. At the company, she was the bartender girl in the eyes of Warren and the people who followed him. At home, she was the 27-year-old woman who reached the door at 10 o'clock at night. Too tired to cook, too late to read Bree a story, too drained to do anything except sit down in a chair and close her eyes. That evening, Jolene came home later than usual. Her mother's caregiver was standing at the door, worry written across her face. Your mother wouldn't eat today. She didn't touch lunch or dinner, and she kept calling someone's name. I couldn't hear it clearly, but she called it all afternoon. Jolene nodded, paid the caregiver, and closed the door. The apartment was silent. Bree had been asleep since 8 o'clock. Jolene set her purse down on the floor, took off her shoes, then went straight into her mother's room. Darlene was sitting on the bed, her back propped against the pillows, her eyes fixed on the window. She didn't turn when she heard the door open. She didn't turn when Jolene walked in. She only sat there, staring into the darkness beyond the glass, as if she were searching for something only she could see. Jolene didn't call her mother. She didn't ask if she was all right. She knew her mother wouldn't answer, or would answer with something unrelated, or would look at her with the empty eyes of someone looking at a stranger. She only sat down beside the bed and gently placed her hand over her mother's. Darlene's hand was thin and cold. Mother and daughter sat in silence. They said nothing. The dim light from the small bedside lamp cast a pale yellow glow over the white blanket. Outside the window, the sound of cars on a distant road drifted in, broken and faint. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes. Jolene closed her eyes. She was tired down to the bone, tired from the inside out. She wanted someone to tell her she was doing the right thing, that everything she was enduring wasn't meaningless, that someone saw how hard she was trying. Then Darlene's hand closed around hers. Jolene opened her eyes. Her mother had turned toward her, and Darlene's eyes, the eyes that for the past 3 years had almost always been clouded and far away, suddenly grew bright. For a few seconds, only a few seconds, but in those few seconds, Darlene looked at Jolene, truly looked at her. Not at a stranger, not through her without seeing. She looked at her daughter. She recognized her daughter. She held Jolene's hand tightly, her fingers squeezed with a strength Jolene hadn't known that frail hand still had. Then Darlene spoke. Her voice was hoarse, slow, but every word was clear. "My daughter is so good. I knew it." 6 words. Jolene heard each word fall into the silence, like drops of water falling onto the surface of a still lake. She looked at her mother. Her mother was here, truly here. For the first time in many months, her mother recognized her. Then the light in Darlene's eyes went out, slowly, like a candle blown by the wind. She released Jolene's hand. She turned back toward the window. Her face returned to its familiar emptiness, as if those few seconds had never happened. Jolene sat still. Then the tears came, without a sound, without sobbing, without crying out, only tears, quiet tears, running down her cheeks in the dark. This was the first time Jolene had cried since the day she left school, since the day her brother died, since the day she realized she would have to carry everything alone. She hadn't allowed herself to cry for so long, because crying didn't solve anything, because crying was a luxury, because crying meant admitting she couldn't bear it anymore. But tonight, in the dim room, beside the mother who had forgotten who she was, those 6 words broke everything open. "My daughter is so good. I knew it." Jolene cried in silence until the tears stopped on their own. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood, gently helped her mother lie down, and pulled the blanket up over her chest. She stood there looking at her mother a little longer. Then she walked out to the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She wouldn't give up. Not because she was strong, but because her mother, even for only a few brief seconds, had still seen her, still recognized her, still believed in her. And Jolene wouldn't let her mother be wrong. That night, after wiping away her tears and opening her laptop at the kitchen table, Jolene began working on the assignment Grant had given her at the start of the week. She was to review the partner list of the Holloway Foundation, the charitable fund established by the corporation, which specialized in supporting education and community programs in Miami. The task was simple: go through the partner organizations, see who was receiving money from the foundation, and make sure the money was going where it was supposed to go. There were more than 20 organizations on the list. Most of them were clear, with long histories of work and public reports. But one name stood out because Warren Prescott had recommended it with unusual enthusiasm in 3 consecutive meetings before Jolene joined the company. The organization was called BrightPath. Jolene opened BrightPath's website. The design was beautiful, the images professional, and the mission statement was full of inspiring words about supporting education for disadvantaged youth in Miami. But when Jolene read the financial report, she noticed something. The numbers didn't match. BrightPath claimed it was supporting 7 community centers. The funding from the Holloway Foundation to BrightPath over the past year was nearly $500,000. But BrightPath's spending report listed everything in vague, general categories, with no specific allocation for each center, no receipts, and no confirmation from the recipients of the funds. Jolene didn't sit still with the numbers on the screen. The next morning, she got in her car and went to the community centers BrightPath claimed to support. The first center was in Little Haiti. She asked the manager about the funding from BrightPath. The manager frowned. BrightPath? They came here once about 8 months ago, took a few pictures, and said they would send equipment and materials. We haven't received anything. The second center was in Overtown. The answer was the same. BrightPath had contacted them, made promises, taken pictures, then disappeared. The third center was in Liberty City. The person in charge didn't know what BrightPath was. Jolene visited all 7 centers in 2 days. The result was the same. BrightPath was an empty shell. Nearly $500,000 from the Holloway Foundation flowed into this organization every year, and almost none of it reached the places it was supposedly meant to help. Where did the money go? Jolene returned to the office, closed her door, and opened her laptop. She began tracing the money. BrightPath received money from the Holloway Foundation, then transferred most of it into an item called strategic consulting fees. Those fees flowed to a small company called Chambers Consulting Group. Jolene searched the company name. Chambers Consulting Group had been founded 2 years earlier, with its registered office at an address in Coral Gables. Sole owner, Nicole Chambers. Jolene searched further. Nicole Chambers, 31 years old, former public relations employee, and on Nicole's personal social media page, in photos from trips, dinners, and events, one man appeared again and again. Warren Prescott. Nicole Chambers was Warren's girlfriend. Warren was funneling money from the Holloway Foundation's charity fund through BrightPath and into his girlfriend's company. Nearly $500,000 a year. Jolene leaned back in her chair and looked at the screen. She wasn't surprised. From the first week, she had sensed something wrong about Warren. But sensing was one thing. Evidence was another. And now, she had evidence. But the story didn't stop there. While tracing BrightPath's money trail, Jolene had to read through dozens of internal financial reports from Holloway Holdings. And in that pile of records, she saw other things. Large transactions, very large ones, moving through Holloway Holdings subsidiaries in a way that even someone who had studied psychology and didn't have an accounting degree could see was abnormal. Money moved from one company to another, passed through 2 or 3 different legal entities, then disappeared into accounts Jolene didn't have access to. That flow of money didn't look like ordinary business activity. It looked as though someone was intentionally forcing the money through as many layers as possible before it reached its final destination. Jolene knew what she was looking at. Not Warren, Grant. This was the underground operation of the very man who had hired her. She closed the laptop, then opened it again, then closed it once more. She sat in her office, beneath the cold white fluorescent lights on the ceiling, while outside the glass door, the sky had already gone dark. On her desk now lay 2 files. One was about Warren, BrightPath, and Nicole Chambers. The evidence was clear, specific, and strong enough to bring into the light. The other file was thinner, only handwritten notes she had made about unusual transactions within Holloway Holdings' subsidiary system. Not enough to draw a conclusion, but enough to ask questions. Jolene looked at the 2 files. She knew she would have to open one of them first, and she knew which file she opened first would decide who she became in this story. The obedient employee who only reported what she was allowed to report, or the woman who dared to look the most powerful boss on the East Coast straight in the eye and ask him directly. The next morning, Jolene took both files and went straight to Grant's office. She knocked, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. Grant was sitting behind his desk, reading documents. He looked up, looked at her, then looked at the 2 files in her hands. He didn't ask. He waited. Jolene placed the first file on the desk. Warren Prescott has been funneling money from the Holloway Foundation through an organization called BrightPath. BrightPath is an empty shell. It has no real activity at any of the community centers it claims to support. The money flows into a consulting company owned by Nicole Chambers, Warren's girlfriend, nearly $500,000 a year. She opened the file and turned each page. Photographs from the community centers, confirmations from the managers, a money flow chart, the business registration for Chambers Consulting Group, screenshots from Nicole's social media with Warren. The evidence was specific, clear, and impossible to deny. Grant listened from beginning to end, turning each page without interrupting. When Jolene finished presenting, he nodded. One faint nod, not surprised, not angry, as if he had known, or at least had suspected it for a long time. Jolene noticed that. But she didn't stop. She placed the second file on the desk. While checking BrightPath, I had to read through Holloway Holdings' internal financial reports. I saw other transactions, large cash flows moving through multiple subsidiaries in a way that doesn't look like normal business activity. I don't know what it is, but I think you didn't want me to know. The air in the room changed, as if someone had pulled all the oxygen out. Grant stopped turning the pages. He looked up, straight into Jolene's eyes. Then he stood, slowly. He walked around the desk and came very close to Jolene, close enough that she could see every stitch on the lapel of his suit jacket, close enough that she could feel the weight in every word he was about to say. You should be very careful with the questions you ask, Jolene. Some questions can't be forgotten once the answer is heard. Jolene felt the threat in that sentence. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need a gesture. The distance between them and the look in Grant's eyes were enough. But she didn't step back. She stood still, looked straight into his eyes, and said, I told you from the beginning, I won't do anything illegal. If you want to fire me for that, then fire me. But don't threaten me. I've already met enough people who threaten. The two of them stood face to face, silent. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Jolene didn't know what Grant was thinking. She only knew she wouldn't be the first to look away. Grant stepped back once, then twice. He returned to his chair and sat down. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. He only said, his voice back to normal, focus on Warren. I'll handle the rest my way. Jolene nodded. She picked up the second file and placed it back on Grant's desk. She didn't take it with her. Didn't keep a copy. That was her way of telling him, I'm not keeping this secret to pressure you. I'm giving it to you because I trust you to handle it yourself. Then she walked out. 2 hours later, an emergency meeting was called. The large conference room on the 40th floor, with the full leadership team present. Warren Prescott sat in his usual seat to Grant's right, confident as always. Jolene was invited to present. She stood in front of the conference room, opened the Bright Path file, and presented each piece of evidence. The money flow chart, photos of the community centers, confirmations, the business registration for Chambers Consulting Group, the connection between Nicole Chambers and Warren Prescott. When Warren finished listening, his face turned pale, then flushed red. He stood, trying to defend himself. This is a misunderstanding. Bright Path is in a restructuring phase. The money has been allocated. It just hasn't all been dispersed yet. Nicole Chambers is an independent consultant. My personal relationship with her is irrelevant. Grant cut him off. I knew last week. The whole room went silent. Warren turned to look at Grant. I waited to see whether she would find it. Grant looked at Jolene, then back at Warren. She found it in 4 days. Warren stood in the middle of the conference room, his mouth open, but no words came out. Grant stood and stepped close to Warren. He spoke softly, just loud enough for the people nearest them to hear. You should be grateful she found it before I did. If I had found it first, this conversation wouldn't be happening in a conference room. Warren looked at Grant, and in that moment, for the first time, everyone in the room saw Warren Prescott understand that he had just lost everything. Grant turned toward the security staff standing at the door. One nod, no more words needed. 2 security guards stepped forward and escorted Warren out of the conference room. Warren walked away, his back straight, not looking back, not begging. He knew that in this world, begging changed nothing. Jolene stood beside the conference room window, watching Warren step into the elevator at the end of the hallway. The elevator doors closed. The last face she saw before the doors shut completely wasn't a frightened face. It was angry, a cold, focused, purposeful anger. Warren Prescott wasn't afraid because he had been fired. He was angry because he had lost. And Jolene knew, as she looked into those eyes, that this wasn't over yet. Warren Prescott didn't go home after being fired. He sat in his car in the underground parking garage of Holloway Holdings for exactly 15 minutes, both hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the concrete wall in front of him. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number he had saved 6 months earlier but had never called directly himself. Before this, he had always used Vince as the middleman. Now Vince was gone. He had to make the call himself. The other end picked up after 3 rings. Donovan Kessler speaking. Who's calling? Warren said his name. Then he added 1 sentence. I have something you need, and I need something you have. 24 hours later, Warren was sitting in a house in Jacksonville, across from Donovan Kessler. He brought everything he knew about Holloway Holdings, The list of secret business partners, the schedules of deals still under negotiation, the internal financial structure, the names and roles of the people closest to Grant. 6 years as chief operating officer, Warren knew almost everything about the Holloway empire, and now he placed all of it on the enemy's table in exchange for protection and the promise of a position inside Donovan's organization after Grant fell. Donovan Kessler wasn't stupid. He took the information, and he used it immediately. In the first week, the biggest real estate deal of the year for Holloway Holdings was destroyed. The partner pulled out at the last minute, for reasons that weren't clear, but Grant knew who was behind it when he heard the partner mention outside advice, warning him not to work with Holloway. In the second week, 2 men inside Grant's underground organization, men he trusted at a high level, suddenly changed their behavior. One asked for leave with no reason. The other began arriving late to important meetings. Grant had his people check. Both had taken money from Donovan. In the third week, Grant received a package at the office. Inside was a photograph of the front of the Holloway Holdings building, along with one handwritten line, "Beautiful building. Too bad its owner doesn't know how to keep it." Grant's empire was being attacked from the outside by Donovan, and it was bleeding from the inside because of the information Warren had sold. Grant called an emergency meeting, a private conference room, not the large one. Only the remaining people he could still trust, about 6 of them, sat around the table. The air was heavy. Jolene was invited to attend. She sat at the corner of the table, watching. Grant stood at the head of the table and laid out the situation. Donovan was tightening the pressure. Internal information had been exposed. 2 men had been bought. The biggest deal had been lost. And Donovan wouldn't stop. When Grant moved on to the response plan, Jolene realized he was leaning toward a direction she didn't want to hear. He didn't say it outright, but the way he chose his words, the way he looked at the men in the room, the way he asked whether the brothers were ready, was enough for Jolene to understand. Grant was preparing to strike back in the way his world had always operated. The meeting ended. Everyone stood and left one by one. Jolene remained seated. Grant looked at her. "Do you have something else to say?" Jolene looked straight into his eyes. "There's another way." The room was almost empty by then, with only the last 2 men stepping toward the door. They stopped when they heard Jolene speak. They turned to look at her. Then they looked at Grant. No one said anything. No one in this organization had ever told Grant Holloway he was wrong. No one had ever challenged his plan right there at the meeting table. Jolene had just done exactly that. Grant signaled for the 2 men to leave. The door closed. Only he and she remained. "You don't understand this world, Jolene. I understand people. And I understand that if you handle him that way, you'll become the very thing you hate most." Grant looked at her. For a long time, not angry, not contemptuous, only looking, as if he were weighing how heavy that sentence really was. Then he sat down in his chair and leaned back. He didn't agree. He didn't refuse. He only said, "If you have a plan, present it. I'll listen, but I don't promise anything." Jolene nodded. That was all she needed. A door cracked open, even if only slightly. That night, Jolene drove home along the familiar road. Miami streetlights cast a yellow glow over the asphalt, with rows of closed shops on both sides. She played music softly and lowered the window so the night wind could blow in. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. If she had, she would have seen a dark-colored car that had been following her since 3 blocks earlier, keeping just enough distance. Not too close, not too far, enough not to lose her, enough not to be noticed. What Jolene didn't know was that the dark-colored car following her that night didn't belong to Grant. A few days earlier, she had discovered that someone was watching her, a car parked near her home every night, changing locations but never changing its shape. She asked Grant directly. He admitted it. She demanded that he stop. "I don't need someone guarding me. I need to live normally." Grant looked at her, silent, then nodded. He pulled the watcher back. He respected her boundary. And that very gap, that very respect, became the opening Donovan Kessler needed. That night, on the road home through a quiet neighborhood, a large pickup truck suddenly accelerated from behind and forced Jolene's car toward the curb. Jolene hit the brakes. The car stopped, the tires grinding against the asphalt. She hadn't even had time to understand what was happening before the door on her side was yanked open. 2 men were already standing outside. One held the car door. The other signaled for her to step out. Not many words, only one sentence. "Get out. Come with us." Don't cause trouble, and no one gets hurt. Jolene looked at the two men. She looked around. The street was empty. No witnesses. She stepped out of the car. They put her into the pickup truck and drove for about 20 minutes toward the port. Jolene sat still in the back seat, not speaking, not struggling. She counted the turns. Right, left, right, right. She heard the sound of the road change from asphalt to gravel. She heard a ship horn in the distance, near the port. They brought her into an old warehouse. Inside, it was empty, except for one chair, a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a heavy iron door. The two men tied her hands to the chair with plastic zip ties, then left, leaving one guard behind. The guard was a man around 30 years old, ordinary in build, not large, not frightening. He sat on a wooden crate in the corner across from Jolene, holding his phone. His eyes lowered to the screen. He checked it constantly, opening it and turning it off every few minutes, as if he were waiting for a message or a call that never came. And he avoided looking into Jolene's eyes. She noticed right away. His hand wasn't steady when he held the phone. He sat restlessly, shifting positions again and again. He wasn't comfortable. He wasn't someone used to doing this. Jolene didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't cry. She sat in the chair, her hands tied, her back straight, and spoke in the most normal voice she could manage. "You don't want to be here. Neither do I." The guard lifted his head, looked at her for half a second, then looked away. Jolene continued, her voice even, not hurried, not slow. "You know the person who hired you won't leave you alone after this, no matter how it ends. Open the door, then both of us can go home." The guard looked at her. This time, he looked directly. His eyes weren't violent. His eyes were tired, the eyes of someone doing something he already knew was wrong. He looked at Jolene for a few more seconds. Then he stood, walked over to her, bent down, and cut the ties. Jolene rubbed her wrists. Free. But she didn't stand. She didn't run. She knew that if she left right then, the guard would be the one to suffer the consequences. Donovan would know he had let her go. And Donovan wasn't a man who forgave. So Jolene stayed seated. She waited. At the same time, inside the Holloway Holdings building, Grant received the news. One of his men called, his voice urgent. Jolene's car had been found abandoned on the side of the road in the Southern District, the car door open, her purse still on the seat. Jolene was missing. Grant sat behind his desk and listened to the call. He set the phone down, slowly. Then he sat still. The people in the room looked at him, waiting for orders. They had worked for Grant for many years. They knew every version of him. The cold version, the calculating version, the ruthless version, but they had never seen the version in front of them tonight. Grant didn't rage, didn't slam the desk, didn't shout. He only sat still. But the hands resting on the desk were trembling, slightly, but clearly. The hands of a man who had never trembled in front of anyone were trembling now. Then he stood. Find her. Mobilize everything. Every person, every source, every connection. I want to know where she is within 3 hours. No one asked anything else. They knew this wasn't the time for questions. 2 hours and 43 minutes later, Grant stood in front of the iron door of an old warehouse near the southern port. 2 of his men stood behind him. He pushed the door open. Inside, Jolene was sitting on the chair, her hands already untied, her back straight, her face calm. The guard sat in the corner, both hands hanging loose, no weapon, no sign of a struggle, no sign of violence. Jolene watched Grant step inside. She looked straight into his eyes and said 2 words. "I'm fine." Grant stood in the doorway. He didn't take another step. He only stood there, looking at her, and on that face that was always expressionless, something appeared for the first time, something Jolene had never seen before. Relief. It stayed for only a few seconds. Then it disappeared, as if it had never been there, but Jolene had seen it. On the way back, sitting in Grant's car, Jolene said, "Next time I tell you not to protect me, don't listen." Grant looked straight ahead, not turning toward her. "I don't plan to listen anymore." The next day, Jolene sat across from Grant in his office and presented the plan she had spent the entire previous night thinking through. The evidence that Warren had been siphoning money from the charity fund was still intact. Jolene had saved complete copies of everything before presenting it in the conference room. Now Warren was with Donovan. Donovan was protecting Warren, That meant Donovan was harboring a man directly connected to financial fraud with clear evidence behind it. If they combined the evidence against Warren with the illegal transactions Donovan had carried out through underground financial channels, then sent the entire file to the FBI anonymously, Donovan would come under federal investigation. Grant wouldn't have to strike. Grant's organization wouldn't have to attack. The federal authorities would do it. Grant sat listening, both hands clasped together on the desk. When Jolene finished speaking, he stayed silent for nearly a minute. Then he said, "Fine. The file will be sent. That's insurance." Jolene nodded, but Grant wasn't finished. "But I still need to meet him, face to face. Donovan needs to hear from my own mouth that the game is over. The file going to the FBI is the safety net, but the meeting is the final period." Jolene looked at him. She wanted to object, but she understood. In Grant's world, some things couldn't end on paper. Some wars had to end with two men looking directly into each other's eyes. Midnight. A small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of Miami, in an area where few people pass through. The restaurant had closed at 10 o'clock, but the lights inside were still on. Donovan Kessler sat at the table in the center of the restaurant. 4 of his men stood scattered around him, 2 near the entrance, 2 behind him. Donovan was dressed casually, leaning back in his chair, a glass of wine in his hand, confident like a man sitting in his own home. Then, the restaurant door opened. Grant walked in. Alone. No men, no bodyguards, no one beside him. Donovan's 4 men all looked toward the door at once. Their hands moved by reflex, but Grant walked straight past them, not looking, not stopping, as if they didn't exist. He pulled out the chair across from Donovan and sat down. Donovan looked at him, his mouth smiling while his eyes did not. Alone, brave, or stupid? Grant didn't answer the question. He placed an envelope on the table, right beside Donovan's glass of wine. A copy. Inside is the full file on your illegal transactions over the past 3 years, along with evidence that Warren Prescott stole funds from the Holloway Foundation while you're protecting him. The originals are in 3 different places you'll never find. If anything happens to me or any one of mine, this file reaches the FBI within 12 hours. Donovan set down his wine glass. The smile on his face faded a little, but it was still there. He opened the envelope and flipped through a few pages. His eyes scanned quickly, then stopped on one page, then the next. The smile vanished completely. He closed the envelope and looked up. Donovan's eyes moved from the envelope to Grant, then stopped at Grant's left wrist. The old watch, its glass face slightly scratched, its leather strap worn. Donovan recognized it. He had recognized that watch a very long time ago. "Still wearing your father's watch, huh?" "He was wearing it the last time I saw him, too." Beneath the table, Grant's hand clenched, so tight his knuckles turned white. His 10 fingers locked together until the joints stood out sharply. But above the table, on his face, nothing changed. Not one muscle in Grant's face moved. Not one flicker passed through his eyes. He looked at Donovan and said, "I'm giving you a chance my father never had. Pull out of my territory. Completely. Permanently. This is the only time I'm making the offer." Donovan looked at Grant. 2 bosses sat across from each other at the same table, less than 1 meter apart. One had brought 4 men, one had come empty-handed, and the man who came empty-handed was the one controlling the game. Grant stood. He buttoned his suit jacket, 1 button at a time, slowly. Then he turned his back and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't say another word. Donovan's 4 men watched him go, then looked to Donovan, waiting for an order. Donovan gave none. He sat there, staring at the restaurant door as it closed behind Grant, and for the first time in many years, he couldn't smile. Outside, Grant got into the back seat of the car. The driver started the engine, and the car rolled away. Grant sat motionless in the darkness of the back seat. He looked down at his 2 hands. They were still trembling, slightly but clearly. He clenched them, then opened them, then clenched them again. In his mind, Jolene's words echoed. The words she had spoken to him in the conference room the day before. "If you handle him that way, you'll become the very thing you hate most." She had been right. Tonight, he had chosen another way. Not because he had become weaker, but because he had understood something the night shift bartender had seen before he did. Calm doesn't mean having no emotion. Calm is when emotion rises all the way into your throat, and you still choose which action to set down first. 3 weeks after the meeting at the Italian restaurant, Donovan Kessler pulled out of Miami. No noise, no announcement, no street war. He simply disappeared from every operation in the South Florida area. But the story didn't end there. The anonymous file had been sent exactly according to Jolene's plan. The FBI opened an official investigation into Donovan Kessler's financial transactions and the network connected to him. Warren Prescott was arrested 2 weeks later. At the apartment in Jacksonville, where he had been hiding under Donovan's protection, on charges connected to financial fraud and money laundering through the Bright Path organization. The Holloway Holdings empire became stable again. The cracks were sealed, the empty positions were filled, and Grant Holloway, for the first time in many years, sat in his office without feeling that someone was stabbing him in the back. 1 month later, Grant called Jolene into his office. On his desk was an appointment file. Director of the Holloway Foundation. This position is yours starting today. Jolene looked at the file, then looked at Grant. I'm a bartender. Grant looked at her. You're the person who found $490,000 stolen in 4 days. You convinced an 80-year-old woman when an entire legal team couldn't. You sat tied up in a warehouse and still made the guard untie you himself. You're not a bartender. You're the thing I spent 10 years searching for without knowing I was searching. Jolene accepted the position. And the first thing she did in her new role wasn't organize a launch party, wasn't hold a press conference, wasn't meet with donors. She sat in her office, opened her laptop, and began writing a proposal for a program she had been thinking about for a long time, long before she ever stepped into Holloway Holdings. From the nights she sat at the kitchen table counting bills and looking at the unfinished college degree tucked inside a drawer, the program was called Second Shift, a scholarship and support fund for women who had been forced to leave school because of family burdens. Women like her. Women mixing cocktails at 2 o'clock in the morning, wiping tables in restaurants, working cash registers at supermarkets, raising children alone, caring for sick parents, carrying everything on their shoulders without anyone asking whether they were all right. Second Shift would pay tuition, help hold their place at the university, support the cost of caregiving for loved ones while they were in school, and include an advisor to walk beside them through the entire process. Jolene designed the program based on the very things she had lacked when she had to leave school. She knew exactly what these women needed, because she was one of them. The program was approved. The first round accepted 20 women. When the news about Second Shift was posted on the Holloway Foundation website, a freelance journalist who was writing about charities in Miami happened to read it. She became curious. The director of a major corporate charitable foundation, without a college degree, a former night shift bartender? The journalist dug deeper, and the story broke open. The article was published in a local Miami newspaper. Within 3 days, it was shared thousands of times. 1 week later, major newspapers reached out for interviews. The story of the night shift bartender, who became the director of a charitable foundation, spread across the country. In Jolene's first television interview, the reporter asked her, "What do you think it was about Mr. Holloway that made him see potential in a bartender?" Jolene looked into the camera, stayed silent for 2 seconds, then said, "He didn't pity me. He saw me. The greatest thing isn't being saved, it's being seen. And now, my job is to see other people." That afternoon, Jolene came home earlier than usual. She opened the door, and as soon as she set her bag down, she heard small feet pattering across the floor. Bree rushed out of the room, holding a large sheet of paper, her eyes shining. "Auntie, look what I drew." Jolene knelt down to Bree's eye level. The little girl held up the picture, crayon on white paper. In the drawing, there were 3 people. A tall woman with long hair, wearing a square cap on her head. Beside her was a tiny little girl holding the woman's hand. And on the other side was an old woman sitting in a chair, waving. Jolene looked at the picture. She recognized the square cap on the woman's head, a graduation cap. "Why did you draw me wearing this hat?" Bree smiled, the biggest smile a 7-year-old face could hold. "Because you're going to wear it. I know you are." Jolene looked at the picture, looked at the tiny little girl holding her aunt's hand in the drawing, looked at the grandmother sitting in the chair, waving. Then she pulled Bree into her arms and held her tight. Her eyes grew wet, but this time, she didn't cry. This time, she smiled. Smiled with wet eyes. Smiled with the crayon drawing in her hand. Smiled because a 7-year-old child believed in her future more than she had ever believed in herself. Late at night, Grant's penthouse on the highest floor of the tower overlooking Biscayne Bay. Jolene came to deliver the new project file for second shift, the proposal to expand the program into 2 cities beyond Miami. She knocked on the door. The attendant opened it and told her Grant was outside on the balcony. Jolene placed the file on the living room table, then stepped out onto the balcony. Grant stood there, both hands resting on the railing, looking down at Miami at night. Millions of lights stretched below, from downtown all the way to the shoreline, flickering like a glowing carpet laid out to the edge of the horizon. Jolene stood beside him. She said nothing. The two of them stood in silence, looking down at the city, listening to the soft wind move past the railing. It was the kind of silence between two people who didn't need to speak to understand what the other was thinking. Then Grant spoke. His voice was lower than usual, slower than usual, as if every word had to pass through some wall inside him before it was allowed out. My father died when I was 16, betrayed by the person he trusted most. I stood there watching everything fall apart, and I promised myself one thing: never trust anyone again, buy loyalty with money, keep people with fear. That was the safest way. He stopped, looked down at the city, then continued. Then you appeared. A night shift bartender who walked straight toward a man holding a knife while the whole room ran. You aren't afraid of me. You don't need my power. You're willing to walk away if I cross your boundaries. You look me in the eye and say the things no one else dares to say. He turned to look at Jolene. You're the first person who showed me loyalty can come on its own. It doesn't need to be bought. It doesn't need to be forced. It comes by itself, when people believe they're being seen exactly as they are. Jolene didn't say anything. She only stood there, looking at him, letting him finish, because she understood that Grant Holloway wasn't a man who opened up often, and what he had just said, perhaps he had been holding inside for a very long time. Grant looked down at his left wrist, the old watch. He had worn it every day for 17 years. It had been on his wrist when he signed his first contract, when he built his empire, when he sat across from Donovan Kessler, when he clenched his hand beneath the table until his knuckles turned white. It was the thing that connected him to his father, but it was also the thing that connected him to pain. Grant took the watch off, slowly, one movement at a time. He placed it on the railing and looked at it lying there, its scratched glass face catching the city lights. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up, gently, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, close to his heart, but no longer on his wrist. The pain was still there. He didn't throw it away. He didn't forget. He only chose not to let it tighten around his wrist every day anymore. The two of them stood silently on the balcony, looking down at the city at night. Millions of people down there were living, trying, carrying burdens on their shoulders that no one could see, searching for someone willing to listen, hoping tomorrow would be different from today, just as Jolene had once hoped. Just as Grant was beginning to learn how to hope. This story isn't a fairy tale. There is no prince on a white horse. There is no magic that transforms anyone's life overnight. There is only a 27-year-old girl who refused to collapse, no matter how many times life pressed its weight onto her shoulders. And there is the most powerful man on the east coast of the United States, learning for the first time in his life how to trust another human being, not because of fear or money, but because she deserved it. Jolene didn't change because of money. She changed because someone finally saw her, truly saw her. Among millions of people the world walked past without ever looking back. Grant didn't change because of love. He changed because, for the first time, someone dared to tell him the truth without fearing the consequences. Sometimes, the strongest thing we can do is not fight. It is to stand still, hold our boundaries, and believe that kindness is not weakness. It is the rarest strength in the world. Each of us carries burdens on our shoulders that other people can't see. Each of us has moments when we want to give up. But if Jolene's story teaches us anything, it is this: you don't need someone to save you. You only need one person to see you, and sometimes that person appears in the place you least expect. If this story touched you, press the like button so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that life can still change. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. We would love to hear how you feel. What did this story make you think about? Was there a moment that touched you the most? Write it in the comments below. Share the thoughts from deep inside your heart. We read every comment and treasure every word you send us. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye. and see you again in the next video.